EGROW Foundation. As you know, the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare is a research-based advice, just about 3 years old. And since the time of COVID, we have initiated a series of webinars wherein we have invited the best minds from across the world to come and speak to us on these. We have invited to come and speak to us, Paul Kramer and Paul Milgram, Michael Kramer and Paul Milgram, as well as we have had a very good blend of economists from across the world speaking to us, as well as economists from our own country speak to us on contemporary issues. It is in this very context that we have had the privilege to host today Dr. Bibek Debroy, who has come out with a very good book, Inked in India. And more than the story of the ink, he speaks about the macroeconomic issues along the journey of the ink. To chair the session, we have Dr. Rakesh Mohan to chair the session. Let me briefly introduce both of them, and then I hand over the mic to Dr. Rakesh Mohan to conduct the proceedings. Actually, both of them are because this forum we are on is President and Distinguished Fellow at the Center and Social Economic Progress in Delhi. He was the Deputy Governor of the RBI since, and I know him since that time, and he was also the Executive Director on the board of the International Monetary Fund. He has also worked as Secretary Economic Affairs and Chief Economic Advisor of the Ministry of Finance, Government of India. And of course, he's also on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Dr. Rakesh Mohan has worked in the World Bank and the Planning Commission. I would say his magnum opus, or the most famous influential work, is the India Infrastructure Report of 1996, and then the Indian Railway Report in 2001, and the Indian Transport Report in 2014. He has published extensively and from very well at the Reserve Bank of India. Let me introduce Dr. Bibek Debroy briefly. Again, he needs no introduction. He is serving as the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. He has made significant contributions to the game theory, economic theory, income and social inequalities, poverty, law reforms especially, and is contributing significantly on law. Even his recent article on the law and the delay in judiciary is very, very helpful. He has worked on railway reforms and Indology, amongst others. He was for the fortnightly show Ityasa on Sansad TV. He has been a member of the Niti Aayog. He was awarded the Padma Shri, the fourth highest civilian honor, in 2015. And he was also awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by US-India Business Summit. He has held various important positions in the past, including the director of the Rajiv Gandhi Institute for Contemporary Studies, consultant to the Department of Economic Affairs of Finance Ministry, Government of India, Secretary General of PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and director on the project Large Legal Adjustments and Reforms for Globalizing the Economy, set up by the Finance Ministry and UNDP for examining legal reforms in India. He's been a member of the National Manufacturing Competitive Council from November 2004 to December 2009. He was the chairman of a committee set up by the Chief Minister of Jharkhand to recommend a development plan for the state, and he has been a member of the Chief Minister's Economic Advisory Council in Rajasthan. He was also a chairman of the high-powered committee set up by the Ministry of Railways to restructure Indian Railways. He has taught in the past at Presidency College, Calcutta, Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and the National Council of Applied Economic Research. With this, I would request Dr. Rakesh Mohan.
Thank you very much, Charan Singh. And let me first just say that what a pleasure it is to chair a session where my chairman, uh, Dr. Bibek Debroy, is the main speaker and author of the book, um, Ink in India. Um, what is amazing, well, there are many things amazing about Vivek, which Charan Singh has outlined, but the most amazing thing to me is how he finds the time to do everything that he does, between translating the Mahabharata, um, chairing the Economic Advisory Council, on which, of course, he's very active, writing newspaper columns on all kinds of subjects, which I can't even imagine. And of course, his books, including this latest one on Inked in India. So actually, I feel very jealous of him that I can't do such a variety of activities. So I have to say that I really feel in awe of him. Now, before I ask Bibek to speak, I do have to confess that I've only reached page 96 of your book, and that on a very, very quick glance, since I got the book in my hands at 2:30 this afternoon, due to various reasons. So I've only reached page 96, so you'll forgive me for not knowing what you've said in the later chapters, later pages. But Vivek, I'm really happy that you've done this kind of obscure act, or rather, this obscure labor of writing about ink, or pens and ink in India. It is true, of course, that I think most of us of our age were raised on writing with pens, if not with, I don't know what you call them, the things that you just had a nib with it and had dip into ink all the time. Um, Before you start, Vivek, I'll tell you a story about my father and his pen. So he had I think someone had gifted him a Parker pen at some point. And then somehow what happened was that his Parker pen came in the way of the car door. So the body got destroyed. So, of course, the main thing is the nib in any pen. So he went off and, like in typical Indian fashion, got the body of the pen replaced. But then I think a couple of years later, of course, these pens used to last a long time. A couple of years later, the pen fell and fell on the nib. So he then went off and got the nib replaced. But he thought he still had the same pen. And that goes to how much value he had for that particular pen. Over to you, Bibek.
Thank you. Can you hear me? There was some disturbance while Charan was speaking.
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Charan Singh and EGROW for having invited me to deliver this talk. And I'm delighted that is being chaired by Dr. Rakesh Mohan. Charan Singh gave you a very kind introduction. He left out the most important part. The most important part, so far as this book is concerned, is that I not only use fountain pens, I collect fountain pens, particularly Indian fountain pens. And I have about 2,500 of these. In a remarkable coincidence, EGROW chose to organize it on a Friday. What they may not have realized is that the 4th of November is celebrated as Fountain Pen Day. So fountain pen enthusiasts throughout the world are celebrating today as Fountain Pen Day. This has a co-author, this book has a co-author. And this co-author's name is Shobhan Roy. He works for the West Bengal government and he is based in Kolkata. He is also a collector of fountain pens. That's how he and I got to know each other. This particular book has two distinct strands. They are woven in together, but there are two very, very distinct strands, one of which I will not focus on, given the kind of audience that we probably have today. Contrary to what some people think, even today, industry estimates are that about 10% of the writing instruments sold in India are fountain pens. Sure, the market for writing instruments is declining. With the advent of technology, it will decline even further. But within whatever that number is, about 10% even today consists of fountain pens. What is a fountain pen? A fountain pen is a pen that has an internal reservoir that can store ink. Unlike the dip pens, which needed to be dipped in pots of ink, which Dr. Rakesh Mohan mentioned, a fountain pen is something that has an internal reservoir. And there are different ways of filling that reservoir. Such fountain pens really began to be made in the 1880s. 1880s, 1890s, there were earlier experiments, but they really began to be made in the 1880s and 1890s. One of the things that Shobhan and I discovered while talking about fountain pens in general, and as collectors invariably do, you talk about each other's collections, is we realized there was no satisfactory documentation of all the various Indian fountain pen producers we have had. Yeah, there is this odd journalistic account there is that odd journalistic account there, but there is no documentation of the history of the manufacturers and the producers. And when I say fountain pen, when I'm using the expression fountain pen, I mean not only pens, but also nibs, also ink, and also all the accessories that go along with fountain pens. The first fountain pen that was made in India was by a remarkable gentleman named Dr. Radhikanath Saha, who in the year 1907 started making fountain pens in India. 1907, mind you, and I told you that the fountain pens across the globe began to be made around the 1880s or the 1890s. These were known as Lakshmi pens. And this remarkable gentleman in that day and age wrote a book published in 1911 called Romance of Pen Industries. He took out patents not only in India, not just for fountain pens, for all kinds of stuff. He took out patents not only in India, but also in Europe, the United States, and all over the place. So if you want a date as to when the first fountain pen, at least the first recognized fountain pen, started to be made in India, that is roughly 1907 or 1905. The first ink that was manufactured actually predates the manufacture of fountain pens, because the ink was earlier used for other purposes, printing ink, and it was adapted for use in a fountain pen. So the earliest ink that began to be manufactured in India was again in the 1880s by a company known as P.M. Bagchi, based in Kolkata. One of the things this book does, and I'm not going to focus on that, is it trawls the corporate database, the earlier MCA dating the MCA databases. It trawls the trademark databases, and it documents what is for the first time the names of all the possible manufacturers that we have had in India for fountain pens, ink, nibs, everything. So this is the part that I will leave out. The second strand that is woven into the book is the prism of economic policy making in India as seen through the eyes of fountain pens. Most of us who are watching this, most of us who are listening in, are probably economists, so we know this classic description of the Indian economy: import substituting industrialization, protection, inefficient production, can't compete in the global market. Suddenly the liberalization happens and it hits us because domestic industry cannot handle that competition. This is the strand that I will now describe to you using fountain pens. By the time of independence in 47, we had all kinds of fountain pens and ink in India. There were the domestic ones, there were the imported ones, and they coexisted. So you had a large number of brands, both on the ink side as well as on the fountain pen side. The domestic explosion particularly began to happen in geographical centers where universities were set up. As soon as an university was set up, there was a demand for writing, and fountain pens started to be produced in and around that area. Whether it was Benares, whether it was somewhere else, a lot of fountain pens were also imported. So there were retailers who used to sell these fountain pens. If I'm a customer and I bought a fountain pen, I needed to be repaired. Like Rakesh's dad had to repair his Parker pen. So I went to them. The person who had sold it to me, that shopkeeper, therefore turned into someone who would repair. And it was a natural transition from that to become someone who would make fountain pens. So at the time of independence, 47, we had all of these. The foreign produced in India, the Indian one, all of them. All of us have heard of the infant industry argument. If there's an infant industry argument, I need to compute the tariff that will be adequate to protect domestic industry, to give it a level playing field. I'm sure despite all of you having read all kinds of books on the history of economic policy making in India, despite all of that, I'm certain you don't know which was the first report that sought to calculate the tariff rate. The first report that sought to calculate the tariff rate which would make it a level playing field for the domestic producer vis-a-vis global competition. This was a Board of Trade report in 1948, and this was for fountain pen ink. So the first report in independent India that sought to compute the relevant tariff rate was for fountain pen ink. One of the political economic questions, as an aside, is why was the original report for fountain pen ink and not for fountain pens? In one sentence, the answer was that the class composition of the people who produced fountain pen ink was completely different from the class composition of the people who produced fountain pen. It was the relatively more educated classes with higher decibel levels who produced fountain pen ink compared to the fountain pen producers. What's the next thing that happened? The next thing that happened was GATT happened. As those of you who follow international trade probably know, that although GATT was established in 7/48, the provision that enabled quantitative restrictions on imports on grounds of balance of payments was introduced only in 1954. So in 1954, we had this provision that if you had balance of payments problems, you could impose quantitative restrictions on imports. Accordingly, in 1954, we announced GATT, we declared to GATT that there were these 8 consumer goods on which we would impose QRs. In that list of 8 consumer goods, one item was fountain pens. In 1954, we had the first trade agreement with China. A few years earlier, actually, but the second version of that was in 54. China and India were more or less at comparable stages of development. Forget the nature of the polity, but they were trying to do some similar things. Transit from agriculture to industrial development, so on and so forth. At that time, China had only one producer of fountain pens. It was a private enterprise called the Wolf Manufacturing Company, which subsequently was nationalized. Based out of Shanghai, it came to be known as EGROW. India, as I've described, had several fountain pen producers. We signed this rather unequal trade agreement with China in 1994, saying that we would import fountain pens from China. We would not export fountain pens to China, but we would import fountain pens from China. Those who are somewhat old will remember, if you remember at all, that when we were students, the market was flooded with Chinese fountain pens, apart from the Parker, of course. They were known as hero fountain pens for the most part. And the antecedents of this are what I just described. Progressively in the 1950s, particularly from 1957, restrictions were placed on imports. Skipping the details, whether it was fountain pens or whether it was fountain pen ink, after 1957, I could not import them. Of course, they were smuggled in, but that's a different point. Up to a point until 1961, they used to be smuggled in from Goa. Subsequently, they were smuggled in from Nepal, but that's a different point altogether. So, beginning in the 50s, no competition from abroad. So that classic import substituting paradigm, all competition from abroad foreclosed. But there were plenty of domestic players, so we had competition domestically. The next significant thing that happens is 1967. What happens in 1967? Small scale sector reservations. I've read all kinds of pieces by all kinds of people on the small scale sector reservations, including by Rakesh. And he wrote quite a bit, several chapters for the Abid Hussain committee. No one has yet told me who decided on those initial items in 1967. The Planning Commission is invariably blamed, but that's not quite correct. That was a planned holiday. There were other committees earlier which had mentioned reservations and certainly price preferences, but who actually decided that these were the initial 47 items? I don't have an answer. But what I want to point out to you is in that list of 47 items, one of the items was fountain pens. Today we may think that fountain pens are irrelevant. In 47 they were very important. They were important enough to be named specifically in the list of small scale sector reservations. Ink was important enough to be figured, to be a board of trade, to figure in a board of trade report. Also in the 60s, and I will come back to this point later on, in the 60s, specifically in 1962, the Reserve Bank said that to sign a check, you no longer needed to necessarily use fountain pens. You could use ballpoint pens also. What the small scale sector reservations did is it prevented all entry by large scale enterprises into that sector. It didn't require that existing large scale producers exit, could remain. But all future entry from the large scale sector was preempted and prevented. At that time, we had large scale producers. We not only had large scale producers, we had foreign firms which had subsidiaries in India. Pilot used to make in India. Around 1958, Pilot's enterprise used to employ about 150 workers. Pilot India. Those of you who know about labor regulations will realize that given the labor laws, 150 was pretty large. At that time, there was a completely Indian manufacturing company. It had different names. Let me simply call it Dheeraj, the Sanghi brothers. Their enterprise in Mumbai used to employ 250 workers. So these were large enterprises. As I said, small-scale sector reservations did not force them to close down. The next thing that happened was 73 FERA and the further enforcement of FERA or the tightening up of FERA subsequently. All of us are familiar with IBM and Coca-Cola exiting. What we may not be aware is that something like this prevents fresh entry by the foreign, but as a result of this, not because they were asked to dilute equity, but because of the nuisance of procedures, Pilot India exited. So we now have a double whammy. No competition from abroad, no competition domestically also, reinforced by the fact that in the 80s, beginning with the second half of the 70s, 77, 78, particularly, labor tightened up. They were tightened up further in 84, 85. And there was a large degree of labor unrest throughout the country in the 80s. So the large-scale firms exited. I mentioned Dheeraj closed down. In one place after another, large enterprises closed down. So now no competition from abroad, no competition domestically, production reserved for the small scale sector, and therefore wisecracks about the fountain pen having become more of a fountain and less of a pen. The next thing that happened was 1991, the reforms. More importantly, not so much the reforms, but we lost a dispute at the WTO on maintaining quantitative restrictions on grounds of balance of payments. So now you have the competition from abroad, the foreign competition. And domestic industry, which had become inefficient, reserved for the small scale sector, it could not invest in technology, it could not invest in upgradation of technology, it could not invest in modern techniques, because after all, the material used for making a fountain pen has also changed, the filling mechanism has changed, all kinds of stuff that goes into a fountain pen has changed, the design has changed, so they could not invest in that, and the typical small scale sector simply could not survive. So many of the traditional fountain pen makers exited. They exited completely closed down, or they moved into stationery, or they moved into ballpoint pens and gel pens. And remember what I said about checkbooks. Add to that things like courier services, writing exams, multiple choice writing exams for government service, where ballpoint pens became acceptable, all of that, the nuisance of filling a fountain pen. So, fountain pens disappeared from India. This is the belief, this is the perception. The last bit that I want to mention for you, and this will be news to you unless you actually use fountain pens, that in the last 20 years, there has been a blooming of a new generation of Indian fountain pen makers. New entry. And contrary to what you might think, there are plenty of Indian fountain pen makers in India. Big problem still. Are they price competitive? Yes, they are in a way. They are price competitive vis-a-vis everyone else except the Chinese. Are they attractive? Yes, they are. But what they've still not been able to crack, partly because of their MSME status, is the marketing and distribution networks. It's not very easy to crack. I said I use fountain pens. This is an Indian company, it's called Wazir. I'm quite fond of Wazir pens. So this is the story that the book depicts about the unmake of Indian fountain pens, the unmake of ink, and the remake potential of Indian fountain pen makers. They will no longer be hundreds. They will be 4 or 5. But in most countries, it is just 4 or 5 who survive. The US used to have 138 fountain pen makers. Only about 5 or 6 remain now. I don't know if you know, how many of you know that there is an Indian company, despite the name sounding somewhat un-Indian, called William Penn. I don't know how many of you know that William Penn has bought over the British fountain pen maker called Lapis Bird. And I repeat, William Penn is an Indian fountain pen company. I don't know how many of you know that William Penn has recently bought over Sheffers. The famous Sheffers has been bought over. So Indian fountain pens do exist. They exist in the price range of 15 rupees to about 35,000 rupees. Can they compete? Yes, they can compete, except, as I said, with Chinese. We think of the fountain pen as a product. I'm certain several of you may not know that if I'm looking at a nib, which Rakesh also mentioned in his initial remarks, there are some manufacturers who make proprietary nibs, like Sailor. Sailor will not make nibs for anyone else. It is only for Sailor pens. But there are others who are nib manufacturing nibs for anyone. out of the 5 best nib manufacturers in the world, 3 are German, 2 are Indian. The 2 that are Indian are Canwright, based out of Kanpur, and Ambitious, based out of Delhi. So this is essentially what the book does. It depicts the rise, fall, and hopefully the rise of fountain pens. In the process, it depicts India's history of economic policy making using a rather unusual item. And as I said, it's the first documentation ever, forgetting the economic lens, of the history of fountain pen making and ink making in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bibek, for that rendition, very, very absorbing and interesting rendition of your book, which I've, as I said, up to page 97, I found very, very interesting. I love these kind of historical tracts, which you are expert at finding out and doing. Before I ask the audience, Charan Singh, I assume the audience can ask questions? Yes. Okay, so so please prepare your questions, but I ask Vivek begin with a couple of questions. One question that the SSI reservation came in 1967. So presumably before that, there wasn't any restriction. Now, if I remember correctly, of the Industrial Disputes Act, the limit used to be 300 workers until the emergency, if I'm not mistaken. And then it was reduced to 100 in terms of the application of the Industrial Disputes Act. What I don't remember is how long the 300 limit been kept to limit large production of whatever it was. So my question is that with the number of large firms along with small firms before 1967, was the quality of the Indian pens as good as, say, Pilot or Parker or Waterman or Sheffers, etc.?
Let me not give the wrong impression. There were several small ones, but there were a few large ones.
Yeah.
It is not quite the case that there were numerous large ones. Yeah. Like any other product, the quality of any product depends on how much you're willing to pay for it. If I compare apples with apples, till a certain point, you see the technology also changes. Till a certain point, the Indian ones, perhaps till about the early 60s, the Indian ones were almost on par with what you would get abroad. No remarkable difference. But sometime in the 60s, the Indian product began to fall behind in material use, in technology, in all kinds of different things. Till about the early 60s, I would say more or less very, very similar, not remarkably different.
Thank you. It is a good point you made on small-scale industry reservations. As you mentioned, I wrote a pretty long paper on small-scale industry reservations, and I guess it is partly because of that I was stuck with working on the Abid Hussain committee. But you're absolutely right. One just could not find who made those choices. And those 47 in 1967, of course, increased to 836 by 1991. And one of our biggest regrets for the 1991 policy is that we could not do anything on small-scale industry reservation. And your rendition of what happened to fountain pens, although it's a microcosm of just one item, just tells you the folly of the small-scale industry reservations, which actually dogged us till around 2010, if I remember correctly, or thereabouts. So, I mean, it's really it's kind of beyond understanding, actually. And I remember talking with some Chinese delegation members, must have been in the early 2000s or something, visiting India. and I asked them about protecting cottage and village industries, actually, not so much small-scale industries. His response was he didn't quite understand the question, which was, he said, why would you want to do that? So it is a very interesting history sort of thing. There was, of course, the roots to some extent, which you've talked about, Gandhiji's issues also to do with fountain pens. And that he didn't like the use of fountain pens because he thought the other things that were more village produced were better for usage. So there is that kind of origin of a lot of our thinking of small scale industry. And
Can I
yes,
say something
yeah,
just in
yes,
reaction to
please,
that?
yes, please.
You see, I've been saying small scale,
Mm.
but without getting into pedantic definitions. Some of these were actually cottage. I use small
Yeah,
scale,
right.
but some of them were actually cottage
Yeah.
on nibs, on fountain pens, ink.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, so that's so much for that. The one other question before I turn it to the audience, and I'll come back in case there's time. One thing in terms of looking at some fountain pens and so on, I understand that the Japanese have been very good for a long, long time on producing high quality fountain pens and perhaps cheaper than the highest quality European and American pens when they were in large scale usage. And that there's a high degree of fountain pen usage still in Japan. Is that correct?
Yes, but let me sort of expand that yes. Uh, there are several good fountain pen makers in Japan. A nib is classified, it has different classifications, but to state it simply, there are other classifications, but to state it simply, it goes extra fine, fine, medium, broad, double broad. That's the width of the nib or the point of the nib, and therefore it determines the kind of the width you get on the. A fine nib in Japan will be finer than a fine nib in Europe or North America. The reason for that is the Japanese tradition of painting with a brush.
Yeah.
And many Japanese pens will give you that kind of almost calligraphic touch. What is the difference between calligraphy, simply stated simply, and writing with a ballpoint? You will get variations in the width of the lines. The Japanese pens replicate it. But Japanese nibs tend to be somewhat on the frailer side. For Indians who tend to use the fountain pen, hold the fountain pen much more firmly rather than lightly, I guess it's a bit like the shake hand grip and the hold grip in table tennis. I think several of the European fountain pens are better. Having said this, there is one particular fountain pen company in Japan called Platinum. Platinum is a bit like the Maruti once upon a time, where Maruti talked about having a car at every 25,000 price interval. So the Platinum company has a range of pens that ranges from something like 200 rupees to something like 40,000. So particularly for Platinum, you'll have a wide range. So I guess depending on your preferences, the two best Japanese companies for most of us would be Platinum and Pilot, and of course Sailor for the real connoisseur.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point that you explained on the Japanese because my father-in-law, who is an artist, now he's 97, but he has always used a fountain pen for his writing, and it is almost like calligraphy when he writes. And he still doesn't use internet or anything. If he wants to write to anyone, he writes a letter, sometimes an art paper, sometimes a normal paper with his amazing fountain pen, actually. Okay, sorry, one last question before I've said that before, but I noticed that in your book and in your talk, large role of Bengalis, including the authors, in the whole fountain pen industry, both in ink as well as pens. Am I right?
Well, Bengalis tend to be eccentric, which would explain the two authors. Um, there is, by the way, there's a very good blog called Inked Happiness, which is also run by a Bengali. But so far as Bengali manufacture is concerned, around 1905, there was some kind of a Swadeshi movement in Bengal, which led to the production, to forays into industry, of which fountain pens was one, and also into ink. And one of the famous ink manufacturers in that part of the country was something called Sulekha. So yes, but wherever, as I said earlier, wherever education spread, you tended to have these kinds of manufacture developing.
Thank you. So, questions from the audience, and since I'm less familiar with WebEx, how do the questions come, Charan Singh?
Normally, I get a chance to ask a question or
Okay,
two,
please do. Please go ahead.
and then we go to the web. In the meantime, I read through them and then
Okay.
sort of
So you will.
prioritize which one to take.
Okay, so you will get the questions.
Okay. Sir, I just wanted to check with you. You've written in your book about Rabindranath Tagore and the fountain pen. And that I thought was a very interesting anecdote if you would like to share with the audience. The second one I thought was very interesting, where the decapitated body of somebody was found and the fountain pen played a role in discovery of that. I also wanted to check with you on two substantive issues. I like the way Camlin name came in, the way you mentioned in your book. And I've been using Camlin ink all my life and my children, everybody, but I did not know the link between the two and how the name came. So I was very fascinated with that story. And I was wondering if you would like to highlight that. And finally, sir, I was very impressed because, as you mentioned about the story, the ink manufacturing also happened in a big way in our country. But one of the reasons I requested our former deputy governor to chair this was for a very long time, I thought we Indians used imported ink for the Indian notes, and we did not tap the Indian ink market for the notes, for our currency notes. What would be the reason that when we had such good manufacturers here, we had to rely on the imported ink?
Um, am I supposed to respond
Go
to
ahead,
your
Vivek.
thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Vivek.
Yeah, well, Charan has the right to censor that questions that come in from the net. I have the right to Charan's questions. So one of them about the security ink, I will promptly ignore and veto because it has nothing to do with the subject. On the others, in the reverse order, once upon a time, the ink used to be in the form of tablets. You dissolve the tablets in water and that became liquid ink. There's a company named Dandekar and Company which used to brand these tablets of ink as horse. Then they decided that a camel would be a better name than horse because a camel conveyed the impression of being a hardy animal that could travel in the desert for a long period of time without water. So the tablet was changed to camel. And then, of course, as I said, the tablets of ink became liquid ink. When they started making liquid ink, they spliced camel and ink and called it camlin. And camlin used to be quite popular up to a point. Not just ink, they also made fountain pens. But Charan, if you have got camlin fountain pen ink today, you better hang on to it because it's a collector's item. This closed down production in 2005. Even the pens. Some of you may have heard the expression beer gama. Gama was the world wrestling champion.
Gama Pelwan.
Gama Palwan. And he was huge and hefty. A bit like Rishi Sunak, we can have a debate about whether he hailed from Pakistan or whether he hailed from India. But he was famous at that time. In the 1920s, there was a company known as Gem and Company, which was set up in Chennai. And they wanted to give a brand name to their pen. And the brand name that Gem and Company uses is Gama. Gem and Company has not closed down, so even today Gem and Company sells fountain pens. And by the way, purely in passing, in many parts of South India, it is mandatory that you use fountain pens in educational institutions, certainly in schools, which is why they still sell a lot in the South.
Still mandatory.
Sorry?
Still mandatory, Bibek.
Yes, yes. So anyway, so it was called Gama. Those who are from Tamil Nadu will recall a famous murder case called the Alavander murder case. That Alavander murder case, which had everyone's attention in Tamil Nadu at that time, it had the origins of the plot happened in the premises of Gem and Company. Because the fellow who was murdered used to work for Gem and Company. So there's this strange link between Gem and Company, makers of fountain pens, and the famous Alavander murder case. So far as Tagore is concerned, there is a particular kind of pen. You see, a nib can be soft or hard. There is a particular model of pen called Eversharp, where you can adjust a little knob and decide whether the feel of the nib is going to be hard or soft. Tagore used to possess one of these pens. Some 6 years ago, the Calcutta police informed us, meaning everyone, that Tagore's pen was stolen much after he won the Nobel Prize, was stolen. And he lodged a complaint with the police, whereupon the courts insisted that he would have to physically appear in court to submit his testimony. So there was a huge hue and cry about that. And eventually the Nobel laureate was never actually required to be present in court. The pen was recovered, but it is not clear. Eventually it was recovered from the thief. It is not very clear who he donated that pen to. However, there is a company named Bharati which used to make fountain pens in Benares. They still do, but not on a large scale. The name Bharati was given by Rabindranath Tagore, so their ad proclaims. They still sell a Tagore pen. It's the only, by the way, the only pen museum, public pen museum that exists in India, the public one. So they still have variants of that Tagore pen, which means that Eversharp pen.
So, Charan, have you received any questions?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, but I think Ashok Vishandas wants to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Charan. Thank you, Professor Bibek Debroy. It was a masterful exposition, and as usual, you made it so interesting. The subject that will really echo in our mind for many years to come. Just very two small things. I out of curiosity, I want to. You said you have about 500 number of pens with you. So two things I would like to know, sir. Which is the earliest one you bought or were gifted? I mean the rough year of the manufacturing, and out of this 2,500, how many are distinct in the same? Because some could be repeating. So just curiosity, and I have seen you, sir. You still use fountain pen. I am sure you will continue. So over to you, sir. Just to out of curiosity, I wanted to note these two things from you.
I mentioned Lakshmi fountain pens. Radhikanath Shaha, Benares, 1905-1907. He made two kinds of fountain pens. He made two kinds of pens. The first kind is what is called a fountain pen. I don't know if you can see it. It has the nib. For a fountain pen, this barrels, this part, the head screws to the barrel. He used to make another kind of pen which was called a stylo pen.
Right.
Stylo pen looks a bit similar to a ballpoint pen, but it's not quite a ballpoint pen. It's more like a rotary pen. So what Radhikanath Shah used to do is the barrel would be the same, but the head could either be of a fountain pen or it could be of a stylo pen. There are about 5, by the way, Lakshmi pens. It was named after Lakshmi pens because it used to function out of his home factory in Lakshmi Kund in Benares. There are only 5 intact samples of stylo pens. Of Lakshmi stylo pens, there are only 5 intact in the world, which means really India. The others are all bits and pieces. There is only one intact fountain pen. Only one. That was all bits and pieces. So in terms of my possessions, my most precious possession is this 1907 Lakshmi fountain pen, because it does not exist anywhere else in the world. No one else has that. So that was the first question. This is the earliest fountain pen that I have. I have several other fountain pens, of course, later ones. In fact, I have an earlier one from the 1890s also, but that's not Indian. I don't use all the 2,500 fountain pens naturally because, you see, fountain pens are filled with ink and are not used for a long period of time. It clogs up the pen. So there are about 30 odd fountain pens that I use regularly. Depends a little bit on what I want to do with that fountain pen, meaning which fountain pen I choose, because Rakesh will appreciate this, or everyone will appreciate this, that to use a fountain pen, you need good quality paper. And the paper today is not very amenable for a fountain pen to be used. And what Rakesh will appreciate, and those who will have worked in government will appreciate, that the green sheets of paper in government are not very amenable for use to write fountain pens. So whenever I write on files, because the paper acts like blotting paper, so whenever I write on files or whenever I have to sign a book, autograph a book, you tend to use fountain pens with extra fine nibs so that the blotting action does not happen. So typically those pens would be Sailor or Platinum, the two that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes a Pilot. Remember I said Japanese pens tend to have thinner nibs. If I want to write by hand, a letter with hand with great variation in the lengths, in the widths of the horizontal and vertical lines, then I use a pen with a broad nib. Sometimes there are nibs called a stub nib, which are even broader. For those, I have a whole variety that I use, including a Parker. Parker, of course, has different models. So I use a Parker 51 particularly for that. I use something like Vizier. And then there is all the rest.
So one question, Bibek, before we end. What started your interest in fountain pens and when? I should have asked you that right at the beginning, actually. You don't say that in the book.
No, because it has no obvious answer. It has no obvious answer. Like everyone else, I'd used fountain pens once upon a time, and I wish that I had retained some of those because they've become very rare. I once went to an antique shop in Kochi where I found these two old fountain pens. And I wanted to find out what they were and where they were made. I guess that got me started. So, in terms of a collection, this is sort of about a conscious collection. It's about 10 years old. That's about it. Meaning the fountain pens I possessed earlier, they no longer exist.
So even more recent than the interest in Sanskrit.
Even more recent than the interest in Sanskrit, yes.
Amazing, amazing, actually, I have to say. Charan,
Sir,
how much more
sir,
time
there
do we
are two
have, Charan?
questions which I don't know if we should take. One is, will the fountain pens stage a comeback? And the second one I thought was very interesting because the question says that the pens are environmentally more friendly and than the ballpoint pens, and that they last longer.
Well, the second one is easy, which is why some colleges in Tamil Nadu have now actually have banned ballpoint pens and insist on usage of fountain pens on environmental grounds. This is the first part. The second part is fountain pens have actually made a comeback. You don't realize it, but they've made a comeback. It's like this, that once upon a time we have memories of our using fountain pens as students. That's not the kind of fountain pen usage that is happening today. Oh yes, it's happening in Tamil Nadu where Brill, which still makes fountain pens and sells them for 15 rupees, was started in 1961. It still sells fountain pens. But today, the student does not use fountain pens. Today, the person who uses fountain pens, I'm of course stereotyping and generalizing, but even then, the person who uses fountain pens is the person who's just got a job, he's become a professional, and he wants to establish that he is different. I'm not talking about the people who carry around moblars, because for them, it doesn't really matter whether it's a fountain pen or it's a ballpoint pen. By the way, purely in passing, I once met a very enterprising businessman from Delhi, I won't mention his name. Knowing of my interest in pens in general, he told me that he will see several people with Mobla pens in their jackets, in the pockets of their jackets. Next time you meet one such person, say that you want to borrow the pen, and you will see that the person won't give you the pen. I said, why? His entire business model was making counterfeit Mobla pens. And then he figured that the people who walk around with these Mobla pens in their pockets are never going to use those pens in any case. So why should I waste my money making the entire fountain pen? So he only made the caps and sold them. So that's the reason he told me that you ask for the fountain pen and they will never give it to you because it's only the cap, it doesn't have the barrel. Anyway, the people who now use fountain pens are people who are young professionals who want to be different. After all, it comes to a question of price. And I'm not talking at the moment of people who, you see, the jewelry and the fountain pen as a personal accessory, they sometimes merge when I'm in the range of 35,000 upwards, 50,000 upwards. I'm talking about people who buy fountain pens of, let's say, costing around 2,500. In that shrinking market, the overall market is shrinking, no doubt, of writing instruments. But in that shrinking market, the demand for that 2000, 2500 kind of fountain pen has been going up, not by students, but by the young professionals. The problem is they will buy the Lamy or something else. Lamy is the most obvious. And this goes back to a point that I made earlier. If I choose to buy a fountain pen, where will I go and buy it? I will buy it on the net. I will buy it at my neighborhood stationers. I will buy it perhaps from William Penn, a shop at the airport. If I know much more about fountain pens, I will go to a specialized pen shop like Makova in Delhi or some such thing. It's only now that the Indian fountain pen makers have started, the newer ones, have started to make their presence felt there. So yes, there is a market, but cracking that distribution channel takes a little bit of time, and you can see the beginnings of it happening. For example, if I go to a place like Amazon, it will be flooded with Chinese fountain pens. But you will now find that there are at least 5 or 6 Indian manufacturers who are selling their products on Amazon.
All right. Sir, I do not know if you would like to answer the question on the imported ink on the Indian note, or we should leave it for
I
another day.
think Bibek vetoed that. So
Vetoed that. Okay. No, I was wondering if you would like to.
Since it is not relevant to this
Sure.
session to do with fountain pens and inks and go into fountain pens. So I'll duck that. Although I do have an answer, but I'll duck that for this question. I'll just end this, Charan Singh. I think the time is over. It's past 5 now. To just again congratulate Bibek for doing yet another amazing piece of work, which others would never think of, and to express some degree of jealousy in terms of how he finds the time to do this kind of detailed research along with everything else that he does, including, no, I'm not even talking about his official, what you might call his day job, but translating the Mahabharata and all kinds of other things, writing columns. So I'm just filled with awe, and thank you very much. Obviously, maybe you don't sleep, Vivek. In reading about great people, one common thing I find is they sleep much less than others. So whether it was Nelson Mandela, whether it was Gandhiji, all of them slept much less than others. And so they obviously, if you sleep 4 hours, if you only sleep 4 hours as opposed to 8 hours, 7 or 8 hours that most people have, you have a huge jump over everyone else. So anyway, congratulations, Bibek. This has been totally absorbing, even though, as I said, I had to have a very, very quick look before this session. Thank you, Bibek.
Thank you, Rakesh. Thank you, Charan. Thank you, EGROW. Thank you, everyone else.
I must also thank both of you, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, to have accepted my request to chair at a very late hour. And of course, Dr. Bibek Debroy for having accepted to come and speak to us. I'm happy to share 2 important things. One is next week, we have Sham Saran speaking to us about his latest book on China, how China sees India and the world, same time. And then in December first week, we have Professor Bibek Debroy speak to us about the ancient literature that he is translating. So I would invite all of you to please be with us. I'll send the flyer again in time. And I'm sure we all want to learn from Professor Bibek Debroy about the ancient literature and the way he's translating it. I totally agree with Sir Dr. Rakesh that we are all in awe of Professor Bibek Debroy. How does he have that concentration that every now and then he churns out a piece and holds us all in awe of his book? So I want to thank both of you. And then I also want to thank the participants for having made the discussion so interesting. And once again, inviting all of you next Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. for Sham Saran's book on how China sees India and the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.